The morning fog lingered low over the Montana Valley, curling around the fence posts like ghostly ribbons. Elias Moore moved along the frost-coated paddocks, the leather of his gloves stiff against the cold. Each breath came in short, visible bursts, mingling with the smell of wet earth and hay. The ranch, normally bustling with the quiet rhythms of chores, felt suspended in a peculiar stillness. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the faint rustle of unseen wildlife. Elias, who had returned to this place after a year of loss that seemed too vast to name, walked with a heaviness in his chest, each step deliberate, almost hesitant, as though he were afraid of disturbing the silence that had settled over his life. He did not know it yet, but this morning would be the first time in years that something outside of him would insist on being noticed. He paused at the stable gates, noticing that one latch had been undone again. The lock was secure the night before, yet the stall was empty, the blankets twisted and disturbed. His eyes, trained by years of routine, scanned the paddock beyond. There, just at the edge of the fog, stood a stallion. Wild-eyed, with a coat as dark as autumn soil and a mane that caught the early light in waves, he exuded a restless energy that seemed to mirror some unspoken part of Elias himself. The horse pawed the ground impatiently, nostrils flaring, ears flicking toward the distant tree line. Ranch hands had called it mischievousness, blaming faulty locks or windy nights, but Elias saw something different. An urgency, almost pleading, that went beyond the simple desire for freedom. He drew a slow breath, feeling the tautness in his chest. The horse's eyes, dark and liquid, held a story Elias could not yet read, a story that tugged at the edges of his own grief. He remembered the nights after his parents' deaths, the hollow ache of rooms emptied of laughter, and the silence that had followed his divorce. He had walked through life like a shadow ever since, performing chores with robotic precision, avoiding human contact, avoiding feeling. And now, here was this animal, impatient, insistent, as if it carried a message he was not yet ready to hear. But still it intrigued him. He felt, for the first time in a long while, a stir of something fragile and dangerous, curiosity. The horse moved again, and with it, a sense of urgency pressed on Elias's chest. He had started noticing a pattern. 3 nights in a row now, the stallion had slipped free, vanishing into the dark. And 3 nights in a row, Elias had woken to find hoofprints leading from the stable toward the forest beyond the ranch, tracks pressed into the frosty earth like silent cries. On the first night, he had dismissed it. On the second, curiosity had gnawed at him. But now, on the third, he found himself following as though the horse had issued a quiet summons he could not resist. Elias donned his coat and gloves, the cold biting at his face, and moved toward the paddock gate. The world felt larger in the fog, as though the valley itself were holding its breath, watching. He followed the hoofprints through the early morning haze, his boots crunching against frozen soil. The horse's flanks gleamed faintly in the pale light as it disappeared among the skeletal silhouettes of trees. Elias's heart began to quicken, not with fear exactly, but with the thrill of stepping outside his own small, grief-bound life. Something was waiting, though he did not know what. His pulse thrummed in the quiet of the forest. He had chased shadows before, memories, regrets, but this was different. This pursuit carried the promise of encounter, of something real and alive pressing against the numbness that had claimed him. As he moved deeper into the trees, the fog parted slightly to reveal a small ravine. The stallion stood at the edge, tense and watchful. And there, half hidden in the thick brush, Elias saw it. A mare, collapsed and trembling, her flank marked with scars of neglect, her eyes glazed and fearful. She was small, younger than he would have guessed, tangled in a remnant of barbed wire, barely lifting her head. Shiloh, the stallion, was beside her, nudging her gently, pressing his head against hers as though to say, "I'm here, stay with me." Elias froze, chest tight, throat raw. In the silence of the morning, he felt something stir inside him that he had long denied. The urge to walk away, to avoid the risk, to protect himself from emotion, warred with the impulse to reach forward, to intervene, to act. He knelt beside the mare, hand hovering uncertainly over the wire. Her eyes flickered open, and for a moment, they met his, wide with confusion, fear, and a fragile spark of hope. Shiloh shifted nervously, pressing closer, as though Elias himself might retreat. And then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, Elias made his choice. He grasped the wire cutters with hands that trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper, an old, long-suppressed longing to care, to protect, to witness life in its most fragile form. "I'm here," he whispered, almost inaudibly, and in that single cracked syllable, he reached across years of solitude, across walls built from grief, and made a silent promise to these creatures: "You are not alone." The morning stretched slowly around them, the fog moving with an almost sentient gentleness. Elias worked carefully, cutting away the cruel tangles of wire, each snip releasing tension in both the mare and himself. Shiloh stood guard, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling, the taut muscles of his legs rippling in quiet anxiety. And when the last strand fell away, the mare sagged in relief, shivering but unbound. Elias pressed a gloved hand to her flank, feeling warmth beneath the matted fur, a fragile pulse that spoke of resilience. He realized as the sun began to strike golden rays across the valley, that he had taken the first step toward something he had not dared imagine, the reclamation of his own broken heart. He stayed with them, crouched in the frost, allowing Shiloh to nuzzle his shoulder, to offer silent companionship in a way words could not. The morning light, weak but insistent, poured through the branches, painting the forest floor in delicate patches of gold. And in that quiet communion, Elias understood that the choice he had made, to stay, to act, to witness, had already begun to transform him. The ranch, the valley, even his own shadowed past seemed less daunting under the vast Montana sky. For the first time in years he did not feel entirely lost. The horse and the mare, tangled in fear and yet radiating trust, had drawn him into a moment of fragile hope. As the fog lifted, revealing the contours of the land, Elias looked down at the mare and then to Shiloh. Their eyes, dark and luminous, held an unspoken message. Survival was not a solitary act, but a shared one. And for the first time, Elias realized he was part of it. The quiet decision to stay, to care, to love, would demand more from him than he had yet imagined. But for now he allowed himself to linger in the warmth of that first, unspoken bond. He could not know what would come next, what trials would test this fragile connection, but he felt a pulse of courage within him, slow but insistent, like the stirring of the wind through autumn leaves. And as he rose to lead them back toward the ranch, guiding them carefully over roots and rocks, Elias felt the weight of his grief begin to lift, ever so slightly, carried away by the breath of new purpose. He did not yet know the full story, the reason Shiloh had run, or the trials that awaited. But he knew one truth with absolute clarity: he would not walk away. Not this time. Not ever again. Elias guided the mare slowly across the frosted paddock, Shiloh following closely, hooves soft on the hard ground. The barn they reached had been long abandoned, dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight that filtered through cracked windows. He pushed the door open with care, the old wood groaning, and led the mare inside, easing her to a straw-covered corner. Shiloh nudged forward, pressing his nose to the mare's shoulder, a silent sentinel guarding this fragile moment of arrival. Elias's hands trembled as he removed the remaining strands of wire from her coat, the chill of the barn mingling with the warmth that flowed through his fingers. For the first time in years he felt the weight of responsibility, not as a burden, but as a pulse of life moving through him. The mare shivered, collapsing partially onto her side. Elias crouched beside her, holding her head gently in his lap, whispering words he had not spoken to anyone in a long time. "It's all right. You're safe now." His voice cracked, and the words themselves seemed to carry some forgotten power, stirring the air, filling the space with hope. Shiloh circled them, nostrils flaring, occasionally nudging Elias as though to ask, "Are you sure you can handle this?" Elias met his gaze and without words, promised that he would not falter. Hours passed in this quiet vigil, the sun climbing lazily as frost melted along the edges of the barn floor. At first, the mare refused water, pulling her head back at the mere touch of Elias's hands. He persisted, slowly wetting a rag and pressing it to her lips. She drank, trembling, and he felt a surge of relief, mingled with exhaustion. He realized that caring for her demanded not only patience, but also the quiet surrender of his own protective barriers. He had lived so long in the shadow of grief that even this simple act of compassion felt revolutionary. Shiloh moved closer, pressing his massive head against Elias's shoulder. For a moment, the barn was still but for the sound of slow breathing and the faint rustle of straw, a world contained within four walls, bound by trust and tentative connection. Days passed, and Elias's routine became intertwined with the needs of the mare. He fed her slowly, cleaned the barn meticulously, and spoke to her in low, steady tones. Each day he noticed subtle changes. Her breathing became easier, her flinches less frequent, the tension in her muscles melting in increments. Shiloh, too, began to show trust in Elias's presence, moving freely around him, leaning into his touch, accepting his hand on his muzzle without fear. The horse no longer ran at night. Instead he stayed nearby, his ears flicking attentively, his eyes calm but vigilant. Elias realized that this fragile trio, himself, the mare and Shiloh, had begun to form a rhythm, an unspoken bond that transcended language and expectation. The emotional shift was slow, almost imperceptible at first. Elias caught himself smiling in quiet moments, brushing the mare's coat and watching sunlight glint off her damp fur. Memories he had long buried surfaced unexpectedly. His mother's gentle hands, his father's quiet laughter, the warmth of a home he had lost. The barn became a sanctuary, a space where grief could loosen and where he could allow himself to feel again without fear. Shiloh would nudge his side, a small, deliberate gesture, and Elias would lean in, finding comfort in the horse's silent affirmation. He began to understand that this bond was not just about saving the animals, it was about reclaiming a part of himself that he had thought lost forever. One cold evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, painting the sky in muted golds and purples, the mare finally stood for the first time without trembling. Elias held his breath, afraid to disturb the delicate moment. Shiloh circled them slowly, his tail flicking with cautious joy. Elias sank to the straw, his back against the barn wall, letting the enormity of what had just happened wash over him. The mare pressed her nose gently to his hand, a fragile gesture of gratitude, and Elias felt tears spill freely. He whispered to her, "You're safe now," but the words seemed to resonate beyond the barn, touching something in himself that he had long ignored. The air was thick with stillness, as though the valley itself held its breath in reverence for this first act of quiet healing. But the sanctuary of the barn did not remain secret for long. Children from the nearby town, drawn by the sight of Shiloh and curiosity about the mare, began to appear at the fence line, peering in with wide eyes. A lonely teenage volunteer, searching for purpose, tentatively entered the barn one afternoon, reaching out to brush Shiloh's mane. An old veteran, stooped with years of pain, lingered silently on a hay bale, his presence quiet but transformative. The barn became more than a place of recovery for the animals. It became a place where the humans themselves began to remember how to breathe, how to feel, how to connect. Elias observed these moments with a mixture of awe and humility, understanding that the ripple of care he had initiated extended far beyond his immediate concern for the mare and the stallion. There were small resistances, moments that tested the tenuous trust they had built. The mare occasionally flinched at sudden movements, pulling back into the corner of the stall. Shiloh, protective as always, would interpose himself between her and any perceived threat, his flanks taut with alertness. Elias learned to read these signals, moving slowly, deliberately, with an awareness sharpened by care. He fed them by hand, allowing the subtle cues of their bodies to guide his actions. Each successful interaction, each moment of quiet acceptance, deepened the bond between them. Elias began to see his own reflection in the animals, cautious, scarred, yearning for connection and capable of trust despite past wounds. One evening, as twilight settled like a soft shawl over the valley, Elias crouched beside the mare and ran his hand along her flank. Shiloh nudged his shoulder again, a silent gesture of solidarity. In that moment, Elias realized the profound truth of their shared journey. The act of saving another, whether human or animal, demanded surrender and courage, but it also returned something essential. The bond they had formed was not born of necessity alone. It was born of intention, patience, and the quiet insistence that life, even in its brokenness, could be redeemed. And then came a night when Elias felt the first true shift in their dynamic. He entered the barn to find the mare resting, head low, breathing steady. Shiloh stood nearby, relaxed, his body loose and unguarded. The mare lifted her head slightly and for the first time, met his gaze directly, her eyes reflecting trust rather than fear. Elias sank to the straw beside her, the magnitude of what had transpired settling deep into his bones. In the soft light of the lantern, he traced a finger along Shiloh's mane, feeling the warmth and vitality thrumming beneath. This was the first moment of true connection, unspoken yet undeniable, a quiet acknowledgement that they had survived the darkness together. And as he sat there, the barn filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the occasional snort, and the faint rustle of straw, Elias understood that this was only the beginning. He had not merely saved two animals, he had begun to open the door to a world of trust, hope, and renewal. In the silent communion of that barn, he glimpsed the possibility of something larger than himself, a life in which care and courage could create ripples that extended far beyond the confines of loss and grief. And as he lay back on the straw, watching the fog curl around the edges of the windows like smoke, he realized that for the first time in years, he felt whole in a way he had thought impossible. The valley was quiet that night, the moon rising pale and deliberate over the distant hills. Elias moved through the barn, checking the mare and Shiloh, each step careful, each breath measured. The mare stood, restless but steady, and Shiloh nudged Elias's side with a familiar, grounding pressure. He ran a hand along the stallion's neck, feeling the muscles tense and relax beneath his fingers, sensing the rhythm of life he had long forgotten in himself. He thought he had grown used to the quiet of the barn, to the fragile peace they had built, but that night the air felt heavier, expectant, as if something unseen waited in the shadows. Shiloh suddenly shifted, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. He circled the mare, pawing the straw with a soft thud. Elias's chest tightened. Something was wrong. The mare's breathing had grown uneven, shallow, and the small muscles of her flanks twitched with effort. He knelt beside her, pressing a hand to her side, feeling the rapid, uneven pulse beneath his fingers. "It's okay, stay calm," he whispered, though his own voice betrayed the unease he could not hide. Shiloh nickered softly, a sound full of worry and insistence. Elias glanced at him, and in the deep, dark eyes of the stallion, he saw the reflection of his own fear, mingled with trust and an unshakable expectation that he would rise to meet this moment. The mare stumbled, lowering herself to the straw again. Elias's mind raced, flipping through everything he knew, everything the old vets had taught him long ago. He realized in a heartbeat what he had not dared to hope for: she was in labor. His breath caught. The mare's flanks heaved and the warm, sweet scent of life filled the barn. Shiloh pressed close, nudging her gently, positioning himself protectively as though he understood the gravity of the moment without ever having been told. Elias moved around them carefully, speaking softly, not rushing, letting the natural rhythm guide him. His hands trembled as he adjusted the blankets, held her head, whispered encouragement. The labor was slow, agonizing, each moment stretching into eternity. Elias felt the weight of responsibility settle deep into his bones. This was not merely the life of a horse. This was the culmination of weeks of trust, patience, and quiet courage. He could not falter. Outside the barn, the wind swept across the valley, tugging at the loose shingles, rattling the windows. Inside, the world had narrowed to a triangle of light, straw, and the warm pulse of life struggling into being. Hours seemed to stretch into lifetimes, and Elias, soaked in sweat and fear, remained kneeling, murmuring words of assurance he hoped she could understand. Then, as the moon touched its zenith, the first small cry pierced the air, a weak, trembling whinny. The foal had arrived. Elias felt tears streak his dirt-smudged face as he watched the tiny body shiver and struggle, legs folded awkwardly beneath it. Shiloh pressed his nose against the newborn, breathing softly, his dark eyes glistening with relief and awe. The mare lowered her head, nudging the foal, encouraging it to rise. Elias whispered, "You're here, you made it," and the words, like a spell, seemed to settle the barn in a hush of reverent stillness. The foal collapsed once, then tried again, struggling to stand. Shiloh moved closer, shading it with his body, pressing warmth into the fragile creature. Elias assisted, guiding its trembling legs, supporting its tiny chest as it gasped for air. The mare murmured softly, nuzzling both the foal and Elias, acknowledging him as part of their fragile family. And in that instant, Elias felt a transformation ripple through his own chest. Years of grief, of isolation, of self-imposed exile, softened and cracked open by the purity of this living miracle. By dawn, the foal was breathing steadily, wobbling on its feet but alive and alert. Shiloh stood close, ears flicking, tail relaxed for the first time in weeks. The mare nickered softly, resting her muzzle against Elias's shoulder. He sank to the straw beside them, chest heaving, tears sliding freely. The enormity of what had occurred, the life he had helped bring into the world, the bond he had forged with these creatures, pressed into him with a weight both terrifying and exhilarating. He realized then that he had not merely saved animals. He had allowed himself to be saved, healed by the quiet insistence of trust and connection. The morning brought a flurry of visitors. Children from the town arrived first, their small faces pressed against the stable door, eyes wide with wonder. A volunteer teenager, emboldened by the miracle, stepped forward to help, brushing the mare and marveling at the tiny foal. Even the old veteran appeared, leaning on a cane, and for the first time in years, Elias noticed a smile tug at his lips, soft and unguarded. Word spread quickly: a mare saved from near death, a foal born under the silver moon, and a stallion whose loyalty had been tested and proven. The valley, it seemed, had begun to wake. Elias stood outside, watching the barn fill with life and quiet laughter, and understood that this was bigger than he had ever imagined. The bond he had forged with Shiloh and the mare had created a ripple that touched humans as deeply as it had the animals. And in that recognition he felt the stirrings of a purpose long buried. He could build a place where trust and healing intertwined, where those broken by the world could find refuge in the presence of life itself. Months passed. The barn transformed into a sanctuary. Volunteers arrived to help with the horses. Donations came to support the care of animals and people alike. The foal grew strong, Shiloh remained steadfast, and the mare, now vibrant and alert, moved with a quiet dignity. Elias taught the children, the teens, and the veterans to care, to observe, to trust. He watched as people who had carried pain and fear began to breathe more easily, their shadows lightened by the warmth of connection. And through it all, he realized that the sanctuary had begun to shape him as much as he had shaped it. One evening years later, Elias stood in the fading light, watching the foal run beside Shiloh, the mare following like a proud mother. He knelt on the soft grass, letting the last rays of sun fall on his face. The air was thick with the scent of hay, earth, and life itself. The valley stretched endless and forgiving before him. He reached out, and the foal pressed its nose into his hand, warm and trusting. Shiloh nudged him gently, and the mare rested her head lightly against his shoulder. Elias whispered, a quiet prayer to the world that had granted him this second chance. Healing doesn't come when you chase it, it comes when you choose to stay. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the soft sounds of hooves and breathing. The sanctuary was alive not just with animals, but with the echoes of lives mended, of hearts opened, of the quiet miracles that happen when someone dares to care. Elias stood, watching the valley glow in the golden twilight, and felt a peace he had not known for decades. He understood finally that life's greatest purpose often arrives not in grand gestures, but in the patient, steadfast choice to stay, to witness, to nurture. And in that realization he smiled, knowing that this story, theirs, his, and the valley's, was only the beginning. Now, click the video on your screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry and then feel whole again. Click it now, we'll be waiting.